I'm Kaylee, and today we're going to explore who exactly were the Inklings. Since I started hosting the June Journeys with Inklings Readathon, I've gotten some comments and some questions, sometimes from people who say that they've read Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia, but they've never heard of the Inklings, and some comments from people asking whether the Inkling adjacent or honorary members of the Inklings can count in the readathon as an Inkling. So today we're going to dive into the fascinating history of the Inklings writing group and how these brilliant minds came together and changed the landscape of fantasy literature forever. And we will also talk about why the honorary members and Inkling adjacent writers listed in the description are included in this readathon, and why, for the purposes of fulfilling the reading prompts of the readathon, they can count as an Inkling because of their profound influence and their close connection to the Inkling group, even if they never attended a meeting. Please be sure to subscribe and click that little bell so that you can be notified whenever I post new content about the Inklings, and follow me over on Goodreads and Instagram and Storygraph and all the places. So who exactly were the Inklings? The Inklings were an informal literary discussion group within the University of Oxford in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. While the group had many different members over the years, its most famous participants were Tolkien and Lewis. This was a very informal group of friends. There were no rules or officers or agendas, no set schedule. There was no membership or dues. It was just friends meeting up to talk about literature. So Tolkien and Lewis first met in 1926 at a Merton College English faculty meeting. And despite their different backgrounds, because Tolkien was Catholic and Lewis was initially an atheist, they discovered that they shared a deep love for Norse mythology and ancient legends and medieval literature. The official Inkling meetings began in the 1930s with a group that regularly gathered at Lewis's college rooms in Magdalen College and sometimes at the Eagle and Child pub, which was affectionately nicknamed the Bird and Baby. The more regular members of the Inklings were many of them academics at the university, and they included C.S. Lewis, Warren Lewis, C.S. Lewis's elder brother, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Christopher Tolkien, his son, Charles Williams, who was a poet and novelist, Owen Barfield, and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is actually dedicated to his daughter, Lucy. Hugo Dyson, an expert on Shakespeare. Lord David Cecil, a historical biographer who wrote biographies and studies of famous figures like Jane Austen, Sir Walter Scott, Thomas Hardy, and other Victorian authors. Adam Fox was the Oxford Professor of Poetry and is actually buried in the Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey. He wrote Old King Cole, a long epic poem in 4 books, as well as Plato for Pleasure, where he tried to introduce Plato to the general public. And Robert Havard. This was Lewis and Tolkien's doctor. And Warren Lewis affectionately nicknamed him the useless quack because he was always late to the meetings. But he was actually a very knowledgeable and excellent doctor. But of course, the 2 most famous members were J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And they are primarily the reason why we have this readathon, because I will just use any excuse to read more from Tolkien and Lewis. So Tolkien, of course, is very well known for The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The Hobbit was published in 1937, and it was first read to the Inklings during their meetings. And The Lord of the Rings as well was developed with crucial feedback from the Inklings group. It is very likely that we might not even have The Lord of the Rings if it weren't for the influence and encouragement of the Inklings. And of course, Tolkien is known for various academic works in Old and Middle English literature, such as his translation of Beowulf. And C.S. Lewis is known primarily for the Chronicles of Narnia and for the Space Trilogy, which was published between 1938 and 1945, and various Christian apologetic works, including Mere Christianity. The Inklings provided a crucial platform for these authors to share their works in progress and receive some honest feedback. Lewis and Tolkien, in particular, influenced one another's writing. Lewis especially encouraged Tolkien to complete The Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien certainly helped Lewis to explore fantasy as a medium for Christian themes. Now we're going to look at some of the other notable members of the Inklings. Charles Williams was a significant member of the Inklings, known for his theological writings and supernatural thrillers. His most popular works include War in Heaven and Descent into Hell. Williams brought a really unique perspective to the group, combining Christian themes with mystical elements in his novels. And with the feedback of the Inklings, Williams read to them and improved his final published novel, All Hallows' Eve. But unlike Tolkien and Lewis's fantasy works, all of Williams' novels are set in his own contemporary time, but include supernatural and fantastical elements in the ordinary world. Williams' study of Dante, entitled The Figure of Beatrice, published in 1944, was very highly regarded in its time and continues to be consulted by Dante scholars today. His work actually inspired Dorothy Sayers to undertake her own translation of the Divine Comedy. Williams himself, however, regarded his most important work to be his extremely dense and complex Arthurian poetry. Only 2 books of that poetry were published, and more remained unfinished at his death. Hugo Dyson was another regular member of the Inklings. He was particularly known for his literary discussions and contributions to the group's feedback sessions. He was a committed Christian, and together with J.R.R. Tolkien, he helped C.S. Lewis to convert to Christianity. What's funny is that Dyson actually just preferred general talk at the Inklings meetings instead of readings. He kind of had a distaste for The Lord of the Rings, and he would complain loudly when Tolkien would read a newly drafted chapter. Dyson was not a prolific writer, but he did compile an edition of Alexander Pope's poetry, and he was an expert on Shakespeare and often hosted TV lectures about Shakespeare in the 1960s. Owen Barfield was a philosopher, author, poet, and critic. He and his wife Maud adopted 3 children, Alexander, Lucy, and Geoffrey. And C.S. Lewis dedicated Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to Lucy, and he dedicated Voyage of the Dawn Treader to Barfield's son, Geoffrey. Barfield and Lewis met in 1919 as students at Oxford University, and they were close friends for 44 years. When they first met, Lewis was an atheist, and Barfield, along with Tolkien, was influential in converting Lewis to Christianity. Barfield had a profound influence on C.S. Lewis, and through his books, The Silver Trumpet and Poetic Diction, he had a definite effect on J.R.R. Tolkien as well, who made use of his ideas in his writings with the theme of the decline and fall of Middle-earth. Barfield's most famous book, Poetic Diction, uses poetic examples to demonstrate how the imagination works with words and metaphor to create meaning. And Tolkien embedded this into his legends through the device of repeated fragmentation of language and peoples, especially in the sundering of the elves. Warren Lewis was C.S. Lewis's elder brother. Lewis nicknamed him Warnie and referred to him as his closest and dearest friend. Their lifelong friendship and love of fantasy literature was formed as they played together as children, writing and illustrating stories for their fantasy world of Boxen. In 1908, their mother died of cancer, and C.S. Lewis, who was nicknamed Jack, and Warnie had only each other for comfort and support. However, in their adulthood, Warren was an alcoholic, so he was often a burden rather than a comfort to his brother. Warnie was a self-taught expert on the history of 17th century France. He actually published 7 books about France during the reign of Louis XIV, including The Splendid Century, some aspects of French life in the reign of Louis XIV. Christopher Tolkien was J.R.R. Tolkien's son, and he edited 24 volumes of his father's work, including the Silmarillion and the 12-volume series, The History of Middle-earth, a task that took 45 years. And he also drew the original maps for The Lord of the Rings. Without Christopher's tireless efforts, most of Tolkien's little memorandum and half-finished poems would probably have been lost in the wastebasket. Christopher was, for a long time, part of the critical audience for his father's fiction. First as a child, listening to the tales of Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit, and then as a teenager and young adult, offering feedback on The Lord of the Rings throughout the 15 years, I think, that it took to complete. And when he was 21 years old, his father invited him to join the Inklings. And his father called this a quite unprecedented honor. Now we get into the honorary members of the Inklings, those who just visited the Inklings meetings once in a while. So we have to start with Edward Tengyi Ling. I think I'm saying that completely wrong. Edward Ling started the very first meeting of the Inklings in 1931 in order to read aloud compositions and drafts of works in progress. However, he left Oxford in 1933, at which point Lewis and Tolkien and their friends continued the group. We also have James Dundas Grant. He was an ear, nose, and throat surgeon who wrote medical papers and invented surgical instruments, and he sometimes attended Inkling meetings because he just loved literature. Neville Coghill was a literary scholar, known especially for his modern English version of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Colin Hardy was a fellow of Magdalen College and a tutor in classics. His scholarly work was largely centered on Virgil and Dante, so of course he fit in very well with the Inklings. Gervase Matthew was a Catholic priest, and he taught at Blackfriars Hall, University of Oxford. And his publications covered a range of fields, including classical antiquity, Byzantine art and history, and 14th century English literature and politics. He sounds like he was just a wealth of information. R.B. McCallum was a historian. He was a fellow and later master of Pembroke College, Oxford, where he taught modern history and politics. Courtenay Edward Stevens was a fellow at Magdalen and a tutor in ancient history. And during the Second World War, he worked for British military intelligence, specializing in German propaganda. Charles Leslie Wren assisted J.R.R. Tolkien in teaching Anglo-Saxon at Pembroke College. And in 1945, he became the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon. So he was the successor in the chair to J.R.R. Tolkien, who by then had become the Meriton Professor of English Language and Literature. So basically, he took Tolkien's job because Tolkien got a better job. Then we have E.R. Eddison. He wrote epic fantasy novels, and his best-known works include The Worm Ouroboros and the Zimiavian Trilogy. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. The Zimiavian? Sure. Zimiavian Trilogy. Works for me. So Eddison was an occasional visiting member with the Inklings, attending at least 2 of the meetings that we know about. And his early works of high fantasy drew both praise and criticism from Tolkien, who stated that he read Eddison with great enjoyment for the sheer literary merit, but disliked his characters and found his evil and indeed silly philosophy tending to arrogance and cruelty. Edison was also praised by C.S. Lewis. When Lewis had to go into a nursing home, he asked his secretary to bring him 2 books, The Worm Ouroboros and Virgil's Aeneid. So he must have enjoyed Edison's writing quite a lot. So those are the honorary or visiting members of the Inklings that we know that they attended at least 1 meeting of the Inklings. However, the next people I'm going to talk about are Inkling-adjacent writers who never attended an Inkling meeting, but because of their close connection and their profound influence on the Inklings, they are included here as Inkling-adjacent writers. In the literary landscape of Oxford, in the 1930s and 40s, Dorothy Sayers held a unique position as an honorary member of the Inklings, although she never formally attended any of the meetings. Dorothy Sayers was a renowned writer, best known for her Lord Peter Wimsey detective novels, which are my favorites, and for her scholarly work on Christian theology, such as Mind of the Maker. She was deeply interested both in literature and Christianity, making her a natural intellectual companion to the Inklings. And her connection to the Inklings was very profound and influential. She maintained a significant correspondence with C.S. Lewis, discussing theology and literature and their shared interest in translating Dante. And of course, her approach to combining faith and creativity closely aligned with the Inklings' vision of Christian storytelling. But despite never attending a meeting, Sayers' intellectual contributions to their shared interests in Christianity and medieval literature and creative writing made her an important figure in their broader literary circle. Helen Joy Davidman was an American poet and writer. She married and had 2 sons, but then divorced, and she moved to England, where she had met C.S. Lewis. Davidman published her best-known work, Smoke on the Mountain, an interpretation of the 10 Commandments, in 1954, with a preface from C.S. Lewis. And Lewis influenced her work and influenced her conversion to Christianity, and they were married in 1956. Lewis also valued Joy's opinion and criticism when he was writing, and she served as the inspiration for O'Rule, the central character in his novel, Till We Have Faces. They were very happily married until her death from cancer in 1960. As a widower, Lewis wrote A Grief Observed, which he published under a pseudonym, describing his feelings of grief and paying tribute to his deceased wife. There is no doubt that she profoundly influenced Lewis and his writing, and for that reason, she is included in this list of Inkling-adjacent writers. Although G.K. Chesterton was never a member of the Inklings, I don't think they ever even met. He died in 1936, right as the group was being formed. His writings and philosophy had a profound impact on the group, particularly on C.S. Lewis. Among Chesterton's most influential works was The Everlasting Man, which played a crucial role in C.S. Lewis's own journey from atheism to Christianity. The Everlasting Man presents a Christian view of history and human nature that later is echoed through Lewis's own apologetic writings. And there are many ways, actually, where you can see that the Inklings had a similar literary style and philosophy to Chesterton. Chesterton's ability to combine fantasy with Christian themes provided a model for both Lewis and Tolkien, and his defense of the medieval worldview resonated with the Inklings' own appreciation for pre-modern thought. Lewis especially was fascinated with medieval values and perspectives, and the way that Chesterton brings those themes into the modern world perfectly echoed and amplified Lewis's own ideas on medieval literature. Chesterton's approach to fantasy, particularly in works like The Ballad of the White Horse, demonstrated how mythological elements could be woven together with Christian themes, a technique that, of course, would later be mastered by Lewis and Tolkien. Like Chesterton before them, the Inklings believed that imagination and reason were not opponents, but allies in understanding truth. And this philosophy influenced their approach to both fiction and nonfiction writing. The connection between Chesterton and the Inklings represents a crucial link in 20th century Christian literary thought, showing how one generation's ideas can inspire and shape the next generation. And for that reason, he is included on this list as an Inkling-adjacent writer. George MacDonald, the 19th century Scottish author and minister, cast a long shadow over the works of the Inklings, particularly C.S. Lewis, who considered MacDonald to be his master in the art of mythopoeic writing. Some of MacDonald's most famous fantasies are Phantastes, Lilith, The Princess and the Goblin, and At the Back of North Wind. These works pioneered the fusion of Christian themes with fantasy elements, creating a template that the Inklings would later follow. C.S. Lewis credited MacDonald's Phantastes with baptizing his imagination This book just completely transformed Lewis's understanding of how fantasy could convey spiritual truth. As a Christian minister and writer, MacDonald demonstrated how to weave theological concepts into a narrative in a way that naturally flows with the story and awakens an answering spiritual flame in the reader, a skill that Lewis and Tolkien would both master in their own works. MacDonald was a teacher to the Inklings who demonstrated how to use fantasy elements like the use of mythical creatures and magical worlds, the concept of a fairy tale for a vehicle of truth, the portrayal of good and evil through fantastical metaphors, and the concept of divine light breaking through into the ordinary world. Though MacDonald passed away in 1905, before the Inklings was ever formed or thought of, his influence lives on in their works. Especially MacDonald's approach to children's literature, treating young readers with respect while embedding deep spiritual truths, heavily influenced Lewis's approach to the Chronicles of Narnia. And that is why MacDonald is included in this list as an Inkling adjacent writer. And for the purposes of this readathon, he counts in the reading prompts as an Inkling. All of the Inklings, and especially Tolkien and Lewis, have a legacy that resounds through the decades. The works produced by these authors continue to influence literature and film and pop culture. Their friendship and creative collaboration show how literary circles can nurture great works of art and imagination. The history of the Inklings reminds us that some of the greatest literary works were not created in isolation, but through friendship, collaboration, and constructive criticism. Their legacy lives on in the countless readers who continue to be enchanted by their stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content about the Inklings in June. And leave us a comment and let me know your favorite work by Tolkien or Lewis, or just let us know how your reading is going for the Inklings Readathon. Thanks for watching, and remember, the right book in the right hands at the right time can change the world.